Time now for our Wall Street Week daily segment. And today we are taking a look at the war in Israel. The Israeli death toll from that war with Hamas has now surpassed 1,000 as the conflict enters its fourth day. Our next guest has been at the forefront of peace negotiations over the last few decades as an ambassador in various roles here in the U.S. I'm pleased to say that Dennis Ross joins us right now. He's now at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a counselor and distinguished fellow there. And Ambassador Ross, I want to start off kind of with the context of kind of where we were, I don't know, just a couple weeks ago. I mean, we were talking on this program about Saudi Arabia and Israel potentially normalizing relations, something that I have to admit I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. And it seemed very real. It seemed very tangible. Yeah. And I'm wondering if the developments over the last few days is going to disrupt that in a meaningful and potentially definitive way.
Look, it's a very important question because I think one of the triggers for Hamas's action was precisely to ensure that that breakthrough did not take place. For Hamas and for Iran, such a breakthrough changes the landscape of the Middle East fundamentally. It very much takes the religious element of the Arab-Israeli conflict largely, maybe not totally, but largely out of the equation. It promises a network of states that are committed to making their societies resilient and able to advance in the 21st century, all of which stands in a very sharp contrast to Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the kind of failed possibilities for the future that they offer. So this was kind of a reflection of a desire to disrupt it. People tend to ignore that the Supreme Leader of Iran last week gave a speech in which he railed against the possibility of normalization, talked about threats to those who would do it, and then we see Hamas go ahead and carry this out. Now, that doesn't mean this was totally orchestrated by Iran. They certainly supported something like this. It doesn't mean that Iran knew exactly when this was going to take place, and it doesn't mean that this didn't take a long time to prepare. It did.
Right.
But the aim was clearly designed to sort of frustrate the very breakthrough that you were talking about. My own sense is that we'll have to see how this comes out and whether Hamas is seen as having been defeated as opposed to having come out of this with some sense of a victory.
Well, that's what I'm curious. I'm curious as to what that defeat actually looks like, because as you know, I mean, you're not really dealing with a military in the traditional sense here when dealing with Hamas, and we know that there is a lot of commingling between the Hamas fighters and just the civilian population here. When you think back to some of the deals you were involved in, some of the things that did bring some semblance of stability, I do wonder if maybe one of the big errors, whether it's the Israelis or the U.S. and its allies made, was not confronting Hamas more directly 10, 15, 20 years ago?
I think the answer to that is yes. I think there was a perception, certainly on the Israeli side, that somehow they could manage the conflict with Hamas and they could live with it. That's what you saw them doing. You saw them, and this has been the case largely, I would say, since 2009. Now, Hamas takes over in a coup from the Palestinian Authority and Fatah in 2007, and Israel withdrew from Gaza 100% in the fall of 2005. They did not impose a blockade or a quarantine on Gaza from the fall of 2005 until the coup by Hamas in 2007. Hamas never stopped attacking Israel even after it withdrew from Gaza. Now, you had repeated conflicts that were provoked by Hamas 2008-9, 2012, 2014, 2021. These were always concluded with a ceasefire, and Hamas used all those ceasefires to rebuild and get ready for the next round. So in a sense, the Israelis came to the conclusion they could manage this at a tolerable price, and I think they now have that conclusion, that assumption shattered. So your question is well put. Hamas is an actor that was never prepared to live with peace. When I was our lead negotiator, it was their bombings in Israel that helped to upend the very process we were trying to negotiate. So I think we should have looked at Hamas for what they are, which is an Islamist group, meaning it uses Islam as a political ideology for control and power. It certainly doesn't reflect the values of religion or the values of Islam. And it's an extremist group. It aims to use rejection and violence and terror. We're seeing its face fully exposed by the way it carried out this attack and the way it just went in, focused on killing civilians, and then did things that we would have thought were impossible.
Well,
How does a group take women who are in their mid 80s in wheelchairs, babies who are 6 months and to 3, 4 years old? How do they take them as hostages? But they did. And that tells us very much who Hamas is. There are no norms it's prepared to respect.
well, Ambassador, in addition to Hamas, you also told Politico over the weekend that Israel here faces the prospect of a multi-front war. And if that's the case, if we do descend into that sort of situation, what would that mean for the Middle East at large?
Well, you're looking at a war that will expand not just horizontally, but probably vertically as well. I'm not sure it will expand beyond Hezbollah, although, if Israel is not really keen on expanding how many fronts it has to face, but if it's facing dealing with Hamas and it's facing dealing with what could be 3,000 rockets a day from Hezbollah, I'm not sure that Israel says, gee, I think we'll just let Iran, having provoked all this or been behind all this and promoting it, that we'll let them sit on the sidelines and not pay a price. So there is a potential for this to expand throughout the region as a whole. It'll be very interesting to see what Hezbollah does. Hezbollah is signaling right now that it is prepared to strike Israel, but it's doing it in a very limited way.
Yeah.
And I've often thought that Iran looks at Hezbollah as a kind of reserve. And Iran right now may fear that it could be hit. And it, instead of, in a sense, having Hezbollah go all in at this point, it may want to use it as a kind of deterrent against Israel hitting Iran in the current setting. So while I think there's a real risk of a second front, while I think there's a real risk of escalation, maybe even by inadvertence or misreading, I also think at this point Hezbollah doesn't look like it's anxious to get into that. We'll see if that remains the case or not. It certainly changes the character of the war if they come in.
Yeah.
It makes it much bloodier, much longer. The cost will be much higher. It'll be terrible for everybody. It'll be a disaster within Gaza. It'll be a disaster within Lebanon, but the price will be high for Israel as well.